Hi, everyone. My name's Mike Fong. I'm a senior consultant and solutions engineer at ObservePoint. I'd like to welcome our panel, Joe Christopher, VP of Analytics at Blast Analytics and Marketing, Maltie Maraj, Senior Legal Counsel at Tealium for both EMEA and the US, and also Sal Tripi, AVP of Digital Operations and Compliance at Publishers Clearinghouse. So, well, thanks for joining me. So for the last, yesterday and for the rest of today, you'll be hearing a lot about GDPR. And while it is an existential threat to very large fines, we should really be talking about the larger subject. So our panel today will be discussing more holistically building trust around data privacy, good governance. I see this as very much a carrot and a stick approach, just something we should already be doing. As per Shankar's example yesterday, you should read the terms and conditions before you sign, so you don't sign away your children. As brands, we should be governing our customers' data in good best practice ways, not just to avoid a fine, but really to build trust with our customers and our clients. So, I mean, how can we? What benefits can we get from GDPR? It's not just a fine, is it?
Not just a fine at all. And the thing to do when you're faced with something like this is to try to embrace it. It is what it is. You try to get the good parts out of it. And so when you look at what the GDPR is doing with data, it's really saying that the customer data belongs to the data subject. We are just custodians of that data. And so that sort of changes your mind, right, and how you deal with it, because now it is not yours. It is not owned by you. It continues to be owned by the data subject. So how you treat data, the principles of data minimization. Don't keep data that you don't need. Don't keep it beyond the time that you don't need it for. It also talks about things like training and having the right security measures in place. It's not just training for engineers, it's not just training for marketing, it's training across the organization. And so when you look at the fact that most data breaches occur because of human error, the fact that you're now having training across the organization sort of helps to minimize that human error. One of the good things, and it's hard to think of it as a good thing, is the fact that you now have one regulation across all of the member states. So as marketers, we no longer have to worry about thinking about what's happening in all 28 member states. We just have to deal with one regulation and one data protection authority. And so that makes it a little bit easier for us. I know it's hard to think of GDPR as being easier for us, but that is a way in which it will be easier for us when we're dealing with the regulation.
One of the benefits of GDPR, and there are a few, but one of the benefits is we're finally talking about this. As somebody that's been in the industry for longer than some people have been alive, we've been talking for years about self-regulation and best practices, and organizations across the internet and across the industry have been focused upon putting forward best practices and trying to self-regulate. Well, we kind of failed. As an industry, we failed, and we brought this on because of some of the issues that have been happening. So now we're finally at the point where we're talking about it. And it's onerous, it's difficult, but it's something that we'll get through. And it's, at the end of the day, the vitality of the online ecosystem is based on consumer transparency and trust. If consumers are not feeling comfortable engaging online, they're going to do it at a minimal. They're going to supply us with the minimum data that they can. If consumers feel confident online, and if consumers do trust that their data is going to be handled responsibly and ethically, they'll be more apt to engage with a variety of sites, and we could all prosper despite the onerous law that's coming out.
Great. So these benefits, they will result from good practice, regardless of which regulation you happen to fall under, whether it be e-privacy, GDPR, or some other. What challenges from an analytics point of view does this changing landscape provide?
Yeah, so I think that the challenges differ oftentimes based on the size of the organization. Small organizations have different problems than large organizations, and of course there's somewhere in between there that they share the same challenges. For instance, with a smaller organization, it might be more tied to resources of adhering to these to the legislation, while larger organizations are going to have challenges with getting coherence between all of the different business units and teams in the organization. Another challenge is just the ambiguity and oftentimes the lack of clarity. I don't know if anyone in here has read the GDPR legislation, but it's pretty massive, and there's a lot of legal speak in there, and so that's absolutely a challenge, and it requires legal counsel, and sometimes smaller organizations might not have that same access readily available. And then finally, the other area is lack of examples. So when you look at something like GDPR and that type of legislation, supposedly everyone's waiting for May 25th to turn that on. That's 49 days away. And it was interesting. I did a roundtable yesterday on GDPR, and one of the conversations that came up was, my executive is asking me, well, what are our competitors doing? And there's not really a lot of examples out there right now. People don't want to turn this on until it's time to do so.
It would be pretty hard to see what your competitors are doing unless they're giving away their grand master plans anyway, right?
So, as Joe referred to the lack of answers, we're seeing that more particularly in the e-privacy regulations. The intent was that the e-privacy regulations would come into force at the same time like GDPR. They didn't even release it until January of 2017. They did an amended version back in October of 2017, but it's still up in the air, and that's the good news for us, right? Because as marketers, as people who are in the online space, the e-privacy regulations is going to really impact us, because it talks specifically about consent for cookies, first-party cookies, third-party cookies, and this is going to impact all of us. Right now, what we're hearing in the space is that probably not until end of 2018 into 2019, which is a good thing because it gives us more time to prepare. But the problem with the e-privacy regulations, and you all are probably familiar with e-privacy directive. That's the cookie banner that you see on a lot of websites saying, we have cookies, here is what they are, do you consent to the cookies? It's going to become much more in-depth with the e-privacy regulation and much more onerous. So I'm just saying this to you because I want you to be aware of it, keep an eye on it, understand what's happening, take a read of the amended version if you want to go to sleep, but be aware of what's going on in the e-privacy regulation space as well.
Cool.
One of the biggest challenges that I see as a domestic US-based business is the difference in philosophies and cultures between the United States and the EU. And the EU is much more focused on the consumer's right of privacy. Domestically, consumers do not have that right of privacy. I think, domestically, the industry has been focused on breach protection, data protection, but not necessarily privacy. In the EU, it's more on the privacy side of things. So as businesses, operating on both sides of the pond, it's challenging to figure out how to navigate. Do you raise the bar for everything and be both? Do you focus on segregating your site? Do you gauge certain sites? And I think that's a big challenge. It's not a global view.
And it's interesting you say that because EU clearly is a load of member countries, but from my point of view, I actually see America as one blob. It's just one country.
We're a blob.
But I've heard,
blob.
Yes,
We're a blob.
Exactly.
Okay.
Look, America is the size of Europe, so it is just a big blob. So I've heard on the grapevine that there's also almost a battle between state and sort of federal kind of attitudes towards data privacy, and that some states such as California are going in one direction, whereas federal law is going in an opposite direction. What challenges does this kind of state-by-state kind of jigsaw of regulations, what happens now? Do I drive across states and I get a notification that I'm now in a higher regulation area?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges that is facing domestic businesses today. As you know, we have a pretty tumultuous political climate right now, and our current federal government has lessened some of the privacy rules and turn back some of the data security initiatives of prior administrations. And as a result, several states have pushed forward with their own legislation that's pending in certain states. From a business operating in the United States, that's a worst case scenario, because certain states like California is pursuing its own spam law. I know that's not privacy related, but its own spam law, and may raise the bar on spam. Certain states are pushing, Massachusetts has data breach regulations, very stringent data breach regulations. Each individual state has the opportunity now to set its own priorities and set its own regulations. As an online business, how does one accommodate all those various state legislations? The only way to do it is to string the most stringent across, that we've seen, is to string the most stringent across the board and operate at the worst case scenario for each of those legislations across all the states. And it's very onerous. It's onerous to keep up with everything,
right,
to understand the implications of everything. And so from our standpoint, we would like to see a global federal legislation that sets the.
And one of the problems in the online environment, of course, is that you don't know which state an individual belongs to, right? And so how do you realize, even if it's a data breach notification issue, do I need to report to Massachusetts? Do I need to report to California? Even Alabama, a couple of weeks ago, end of March, enacted data breach notification laws. So it is a very sort of tumultuous environment. But don't forget also, Mike, that the FTC still does have control over commerce. And under Section 5 of the FTC regulations, unfair and deceptive practices, they can still go after companies. And the way they've been doing it a lot is if, for example, you are saying in your privacy notices that you are going to be doing X, Y, and Z with someone's data, and then you don't do that, they're treating that as unfair and deceptive practices. So it is a tumultuous world that we live in here in the US, but it's what we have to deal with, right?
Okay. So will there, in fact, be a kind of a de facto where, one state has a particularly stringent law on one aspect, another state has a particularly stringent law on a different aspect, and digital brands end up having to accommodate essentially the most stringent of each aspect from each different piece of state legislation?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. So let's change tact a bit, or change direction a bit. We've talked about the space. How are firms actually going about dealing with this? How are you investing? Is it training? Is it technology? Is it people? Is it processes? How is investment being put? How does decisions being made?
Well, from the brand side, the decisions are being made from a consumer standpoint. We're looking at our consumers and looking at the legislation and seeing how they line up to our current practices, policies, procedures. We're taking the inventory of what we're doing, matching them up, looking at gaps, and then making adjustments where necessary. One of the key things that I do want to point out is in today's business, no single site, no single business is an entity unto itself. We all have data providers, we all have service providers, we all engage with a variety of businesses. And as we do that, the practices, procedures, compliance for those regulations to not only fall on the business, they reach out to the businesses that you're currently doing business with. I don't know if anybody took Delta on the flight over here this morning, or this weekend, but Delta announced, it was all over the news this morning, Delta had another data breach. It's about the sixth one this week, not from Delta, across the industry. But this one was not Delta's fault at all. This one, they were using a vendor for chat, and that vendor had a vulnerability, and unscrupulous individuals were able to access the Delta website and access their data through that. For all intents and purposes, Delta had good security. They engaged with the vendor with the substandard, and they end up taking the heat. Nobody's talking about the vendor that they were dealing with. Nobody knows them. Nobody cares about them. They care about Delta. Where'd you buy a plane ticket? Delta. You don't care about the chat, who served the chat up. So that's something that all brands and all companies need to consider is, who am I doing business with, and vet out that partner to make sure that they're dealing with compliance appropriately.
Right. So it's almost, there's an onus on the businesses to not only control their own processes and people, but it's also they have to do their due diligence on their technological partners, their contracting agencies. Yeah. I guess what we've seen on stage at Tealium, for Tealium today and yesterday as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, we've been trying to get GDPR ready for at least a year and a half, 2 years. We've really had interdisciplinary conversations about it. And we're really trying to make sure that we are able to facilitate you guys. So whether it's with respect to data subject access request, what are we doing to help you facilitate that in a timely manner? If the regulation says that you have to do breach notification within 72 hours, can we give you that breach notification notice within 24 hours to allow you that additional time to do your notification? So those things that we are trying to build, whether it's from an engineering point of view, whether it's from a policy, a procedure point of view, are things that will help facilitate your ability to conform with the GDPR.
Great. So then, beyond GDPR, we want to avoid this existential fine. I mean, 4% of global turnover, that is enough to destroy your profit margins and then some, right, for some very competitive industries. But beyond avoiding a fine, why is it important for brands to use this opportunity, see it as an opportunity, to build trust with their customer base? Where will this, how will we drive that benefit?
Yeah. Trust is critical. What we're talking about here is my data, my personal data, your personal data, and we're bombarded with these as Al was mentioning, these data breaches. So whether it's Delta or Saks Fifth Avenue was recently, Orbitz, large companies, we're not exempt just because we're working with a large company as a consumer. We're starting to lose confidence that these large companies are protecting our data. And so legislation like GDPR comes from a positive point of view of helping to enforce and make sure that companies do have these policies in place and that they're starting to bring that into the forefront. It comes down to building trust with your consumer, and so that's an opportunity to build that brand affinity, that brand trust. An example, a while back, one of my clients, healthcare.gov, there are a lot of eyes on this website, of course, and we help them with implementing Tealium IQ with the Privacy Manager widget, and we implemented basically the ability for the consumer to have a choice to opt out of tracking. This was the first federal government website to have this capability, and it was all about providing more trust and confidence. And in that process, the healthcare.gov team went through the process of doing a privacy impact assessment and understanding what tags are firing on this website, why is it firing, what vendors are we engaged with, and really having that clear description of what's going on the website, and most importantly, providing consumers a choice. And that's a really critical piece that I think can be mirrored by a lot of even US companies. If you're not concerned about GDPR today, it's about providing choice and putting those practices into place.
Yeah. And one of the things about GDPR in particularly is that it forces you to demonstrate compliance. So you have to have the policies in place. You have to have the procedures in place. You have to test it. You have to do the data protection assessments. And so that forcing of the demonstration of compliance, really goes a long way towards building trust, because if you are showing that you have the correct procedures in place, you're more than halfway there. And so things like the GDPR specifically allows for certifications and for code of conducts. And I think this is a space, there's going to be a lot of happy vendors because people are going to be wanting those third-party attestations of compliance. So whether it's the ISO 27001 or other, certificates, whether it's SOC 2, whether it's similar to what we have with Privacy Shield and TrustDoc, that kind of thing, having those certificates and those third-party attestations of compliance are going to be critical.
Sure. I also think that if you can demonstrate that you've got, great or brilliant or top of the class, data privacy and governance, you have a competitive advantage over in your space, right? I mean, again, back to Shankar's example yesterday, if you came back down to the cave from the sun, the world, and he said, you are well respected by the rest of your peers facing the shadows on those walls, and you said there's a new world out there, they would take that message very differently if you were a total stranger and you said there's a new world out there. So one example is Equifax. They had a large data breach last year. Would you, as a consumer, choose to go back to them? Or would you choose to get your credit risk score from Experian, for example? So I think having a strong reputation and, as you say, Maltie, transparency over your data sort of privacy governance practices is definitely a competitive advantage. So, Sal, did you have something?
Sure. Your last point is a real important point. I think, we all have to do business with Equifax. It happens by just us being. Mm-hmm. Most of us are not like Equifax. Most of us, people have choices. People choose to come to us. In our case, we're an entertainment site. People can find their entertainment elsewhere. And if you're building the compliance policies and the procedures because it's something that's being driven out of legal or compliance, it's kind of putting lipstick on a pig. If your compliance policies and procedures really need to, one, be driven out of the C-suite, the understanding from the top of the organization down that being a compliant vendor, being a compliant organization is a business advantage, is a competitive advantage. Establishing, transparency and trust with your users so they feel comfortable engaging and re-engaging multiple times is a competitive advantage. Driving the organization to understand, all of the organization, marketing, analytics, everybody through the organization, that the data, as Maltie said earlier, the data we're entrusted with is just that. We're entrusted with it. It's not our data. It belongs to the consumers. We are only the custodians of that data. Yeah. And building, the policies and procedures around that, compliance falls into place. There's the administrative end of compliance, but if you focus on the end user and treating that data with the respect that it deserves and understanding that it's valuable, even if it's marketing data, it's not necessarily sensitive data, there is value to it, and consumers can be materially harmed if it does get breached out. Yep. Understanding that is a critical component, and the compliance of it becomes an administrative task rather than a business overhaul at the end. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cool. So it's clear that we need to do it, A, regulatory reasons, and B, it's just the right thing to do. But how? We've spoken at high level. You need to build trust. You need to prove that you're building trust. But how do you actually do it? I'm thinking how do you get people in your organization to care? Lock your laptop when you go to lunch. How do you? Is it from? You mentioned the C-suite. Does it start from the top? But what else is there?
Yeah. So it absolutely starts from the top. Your executive team needs to be passionate about privacy. Can't say that enough. It really starts from the top. Last week I was at Adobe Summit, and one of the things that really stuck with me was LinkedIn's commitment to GDPR and privacy. And one of the things they mentioned on stage was that they developed a company-wide training. And I think this is just so critical because privacy does not stop with marketing. It extends to the entire organization. It goes to your customer service team. For instance, if there's with GDPR, right to be forgotten request, right? Who is that going to come to? Maybe you have a form, but maybe they contact customer service. Is that customer service team aware of GDPR and our obligation as an organization to fulfill that? Really, it's about humanizing data, putting a person behind your data, putting a face to that data, because that's what we're dealing with here, is people's personal information in many cases.
Yeah. It does really help if you have buy-in, because to tell you the truth, it's not a cheap process to become compliant. It's very time-consuming. It takes up a lot of personnel because, as you said, it's a cross-organization effort. It's not just marketing. Everybody has to be involved because most of us play the role of both data controller and data processor, right? We're a data controller in the sense that we might have HR data, we might have data about our customers, names, email addresses, telephone numbers, but we also have customer data as well, in which case we're a data processor. And you have to put processes in place for all of these classes of data. So having buy-in from the C-suite is critical, but really understanding. It was, one of the, speaking with our engineers about what needed to be done to get all of our things in place. And it was sort of like wonderful seeing the light bulb go out just with them understanding the difference between a data control and a data processor. There's a lot of education, a lot of communication in order to make this happen.
Tactically speaking, within an organization, the way it's really started with us was really taking an inventory. We're a 60-plus-year-old company. People have been storing data in a variety of different ways
60 years.
for 60-some-odd years. So you could imagine, back in the days, it was all very simple because nothing was online. No one can get access to the data. As business evolved, the migration to the online, initially, people were, okay, I can create a little database, tuck it over here, and complete this function. Create a little database, tuck it over here, complete that function. And all of a sudden, throughout the organization, on a variety of systems, on a variety of platforms, in a variety of centers, you end up with these pockets of data, some small, some large, some old, some new. So getting control of that data was the first step. First step was taking an inventory of that data. Second, getting control of that data, then going through a data minimization process where, data to marketers is like heroin. They want it, they never want to give it up, they want more, they want more, they want more. But at some point, that data becomes beyond its useful life, and purging that data and getting it off systems. The best way to limit liability is to remove some of the data that's on there. So minimizing the data down to only actionable, real, tangible data. And then putting in appropriate, centralization of the data, storage, proper storage and encryption. It makes it much easier when it's minimized and stored in one central location.
And you've mentioned that you have data you started collecting data going back 60 years ago. Yeah. So Maltie, correct me if I'm wrong, but on the GDPR specifically, data sets or data sources that already exist are exempt.
Not quite. What the GDPR says is you've got 6 lawful ways of collecting data. Consent is just one of them. You have legitimate interest, you have, for other lawful purposes and what have you. What the GDPR says is that if you've collected data under consent in the past, but suddenly the consent is not GDPR compliant, you can't then say, well, I had a legitimate interest for collecting that data. It must flow through with the same thing.
Okay.
And so that there is some stream of thought which says, if you didn't collect the consent or you aren't sure how the consent came to you, it would be in your best interest to reconsent if consent is your mechanism for collecting and processing that data.
Okay.
But that would be the second question. The first question would be, do I still need this?
Yeah.
Why do I need it? What's the purpose of it?
Yep.
How am I going to make it actionable? How am I going to enhance the experiences of my current customer base with this data? If the answer can't be a very tangible answer backed up with a tangible ROI, the best approach is to purge it.
Okay, cool. So as a company's data collection grows, people can't maintain and all keep that organized in their brains. They have to put down on paper a policy or what at ObservePoint we call a data governance framework. So what, in your opinions, is a central part of a good data quality framework for sort of collection, storage, and activation of the data?
I think the data quality assurance is certainly ranks up there from especially a digital marketer's perspective. Data quality is not just about, did I stop tracking data or whatnot, but it's really about what are you collecting, why are you collecting it, are you violating your privacy policy? In some cases, it's really getting that understanding in place. Data audits, so understanding what data you're collecting, very related to data quality assessments. Some other critical factors, in my opinion, would be establishing alignment on what's being measured and why it's being measured. At Blast, we have a framework called Measurement for Success, where we work with stakeholders in the organization to build out this common alignment and knowledge throughout the organization. And Finally, establishing a center of excellence and a steering committee that can lead the way and be responsible for communicating the ways that we adhere to legislation and ultimately customer privacy.
Cool. Yeah, I think there's definitely, so a previous organization I worked with, there was actually a strongman in the office who would play pranks on you if you left your computer unlocked. And I'm not saying that it needs to be, this jokey, but I think, a presence that makes people, just reminds people that this is important. It's, we flicked each other's ears or we sent silly emails, but that's important. But back to the topic, I think one of the sort of key things, and I agree with you, is just to don't collect what you don't need. So many sort of business units, so I've done quite a few implementations, Adobe Analytics implementations, and the brief has often been quite vague, and the business owner who may or may not have been totally data savvy will say, I'm not quite sure what I need to know, but I want you to collect everything so that in the future I can pull out some stats. So if that's a familiar story, and I'm sure it is, don't do it. Because when you collect everything, you're being very vague, it's an extra data storage responsibility and cost, and you never know exactly when it will become a data governance liability. Yeah. Sal, so you've been through the whole end-to-end journey at PCH. Could you just talk us through that case study?
I think you just said I'm old, but okay.
60 years.
Yeah, it's again, just in a nutshell, and I know we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to try to be brief. It really comes down to the things you were saying earlier. Understand what you're collecting and why you're collecting it. If there's not a viable business need for it, don't collect it. It's a liability. Understanding how you're storing it, where you're storing it, what's considered sensitive, what's not considered sensitive. Most importantly, in today's environment, understand who you're sharing it with. That may sound like a very logical thing, but you'd be surprised at how many people, how many sites do not understand that they're sharing data. They don't understand, they engage with a partner and they don't understand, I'm going to place pixels, I'm going to do things. They don't understand that they're actually sharing data and other companies are collecting data on your site. So now with the GDPR, there's a big responsibility associated with that. But, it's I don't want to use the term negligent, but it's required that, as you're getting into vendor relationships and service provider relationships, that you really understand what's happening on the other side of that relationship as well.
Okay. So we've talked about, why we have to be compliant with the benefits and how to do it. But how can what can brands do to show to their customers that they actually are doing it? I mean, how do I go from being data compliant to getting all the kudos for being data compliant?
Well, from a brand standpoint, it's one, having a privacy policy that's easily understandable. If you're dealing with a multi-language consumer base, having multi-language privacy policy. Making that something they could understand. We all read through those T's and C's in privacy policies.
I haven't read those.
For attorneys, no offense. But, dumbing them down to the consumers, advising consumers, giving them notifications. There's a lot of different ways to talk to consumers nowadays. It doesn't have to be necessarily marketing promotions. There's social media, there's Facebook. So providing education and notifications to consumers about data protection, data security, also educating them on their side as well. You set that tone that you care about the consumers. And that's when privacy and compliance transition from a business hurdle to a business enabler. If you could establish that trust with the consumers where they trust you and they think you have their best interest at heart, you've now become an ally to them versus an adversary. Yeah. And I think that's what businesses should be trying to get to more often than not.
Yeah. And don't forget, under Article 40, you have the code of conduct, you have certifications that will come. They're not here yet, but they will come, and that's something that you ought to be looking at. We've got that seal on your website showing that you are in fact, have the appropriate code of conduct in place.
So there'll be a nice shiny gold seal, and you can.
Mike, I wish I could tell you what form it will take. I mean, Article 40 says that it's a mechanism for showing compliance, but it's still up in the air. Nothing's been finalized yet.
do we know if that's something that companies have to renew every year or like
Most likely.
get tested every
Most
year?
likely, just like what we do with most things like ISO and
Okay.
SOC 2, you have to have annual research. I think it would probably be in the same
Yeah.
vein.
Yeah. Okay.
But this is speculation. It's not there yet.
Okay, so we've just got a couple of minutes left. So I want to get a last few final thoughts from everybody. If you were to sort of, make suggestions to the audience and say, go and do this tomorrow or go and do this on Monday, what would they be? And, are there any examples that you can sort of give to, say, viewer beware?
Yeah. I'm sure everyone's in different phases of adoption of this, but of GDPR and any other legislation. But certainly, you always have to start with a plan. And if I were going back to the office on Monday, I would sit down, establish a plan, and get consensus with stakeholders in the organization, start forming my steering committee, and most importantly, beyond that, start auditing and figuring out what you're collecting and why you're collecting it. Just get that under control.
Cool. Sal, have you got any final thoughts?
Inventory, know what's happening on your sites. Inventory, make it actionable.
Yep.
Make that plan actionable. If you haven't started looking at this today, I don't think anybody should run out of here and panic.
Yep.
I think the first thing to do is to inventory the data you're collecting, as you were saying, and start looking at the categorization of data, whether it's sensitive, PII, and then just start making iterative changes because, it takes a while to get all the way complete. But I think everyone will as enforcement starts happening, they want to see good faith efforts.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I guess enforcement isn't going to be instantaneous on the 25th of May this year. I guess my takeaway here would be whatever role you're in, just think, what data sources do I have, or what responsibilities or assets do I have that I think may even have the slightest chance of falling under or being affected by regulations, not just GDPR. But also, the opposite is, think, what tools do I have? What team members do I have that working with me that can help towards this? And then, email that to your manager, and then get your manager to email that to their manager. You have to get the relevant information as high up the organizational chain as possible, so that at least there's visibility on the problem. You never know. You might just, let the data protection officer know that there's a whole asset class of data that he forgot about. So there's always that off chance. And Maltie, what are your thoughts?
I want to echo what Sal said. Don't panic yet. I know it's very close to May 25th, but really, even the French Data Supervisory Authority just put out word that they're not going to enforce for the first few months after May 25th. So they understand that it's going to take some time for people to get up to speed. But also to echo Sal again, the supervisory authorities want to know that you're making good faith efforts in the right direction. I mean, they're not going to sort of jump into fines. They're going to look at what you're doing. And if you're showing that, look, I'm doing my best here, I'm really trying to accommodate, but this is really such a new area for us. So don't panic, take your time, do all of the things that you've been hearing that you ought to be doing here, but understand that really you do have a little bit of wiggle room once you start getting your processes in place. And also, one last thing, sorry, Mike, look to the supervisory authorities themselves. If you were planning 5 months ago, a record of data processing, what does that look like? What does that look like? Well, the German Data Protection Authority just recently put out examples of it. So look to the data protection authorities. They are putting out, sort of very prescriptive things that would be of great help to you.
Okay. So don't panic and read what has been provided.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Awesome. So we're just about out of time, but I'd like to, thanks for the final thoughts. I also like to thank the panel. So going to give you a round of applause. But so it's Joe, Maltie, and Sal. Great. Thank you for your time.